Hi everyone, you're here sewing with Cody and Pete, and in today's video we are working on block 10 of our block of the month. I'm sorry, block 10 of our block of the week. And here is block 10. So this is the second block in which we're using a third fabric. So we're using this, on my quilt, we're using this cream fabric, where in all the other quilts we just had two different fabrics and a background fabric. Here we're still using those two same fabrics, plus like our previous block we're using that cream, that fabric C, in addition with our background fabric. This is also a 6.5 inch finished block. And so we've only got one more little block left before we're completely finished creating our blocks using our Creative Grid Lazy Angle Ruler. So remember, if you enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and if you haven't already, check all the other blocks that we've completed over the weeks. So let's get started. Okay, so here we are. So like in the previous video, I already cut out all the pieces because we've shown in so many other videos the cutting of all these different shapes. And again, we're only really dealing with two different shapes aside from squares. We are dealing with small trapezoids and large trapezoids. And so with the 6.5 inch blocks, we know we're dealing with 2.5 inch strips. So these were all originally 2.5 inch strips that we use our Lazy Angle Creative Grid Ruler to cut all of these. And if you have any questions, you can always refer to all the previous videos, the previous block videos. So, but I want to give a rundown of what we need for this particular block. So here we need 4 squares of our background fabric. So these 4 are white. Then we need 2.5 inch squares from our fabric C, which in my case is my cream. I know on camera these look very similar, but this is a cream. So we need 2.5 inch squares of that. We need 4 large trapezoids of fabric C. And then with fabric B, we need 2.5 inch squares, and those will go with these 2.5 inch squares to create our 4 half square triangles, which will be in the center of this particular square. And these two we're also going to draw a line from corner to corner, because this is what we're going to use to sew these together, and we'll go over that. And then so also from fabric B, we're going to need 4 small trapezoids. And the only thing we're going to need from fabric A are 8 small trapezoids. So that's it. So let's dive into constructing our block. All right, one of the first things you can do is you can take your 4 2.5 inch square background fabrics and just set those aside. We're not going to need those until we actually construct all of our pieces to make our block. But one of the first things you can do, if you haven't already, is take your 2 fabric B squares, your 2.5 inch squares, and draw a line from corner to corner. Then what you're going to do is you're going to place these, and if these were a print, let's just say, we would be placing them right sides together. So you always draw your line, when making half square triangles, you always draw your line on the wrong side of your fabric. So what we'll do is we'll pin these together, and then we'll go to the sewing machine eventually. We'll go to the sewing machine and we'll sew 1/4 inch from on each side of this line. So we'll use this line as a guide, and then we'll use our 1/4 inch foot, and we'll sew 1/4 inch to this side of the line and 1/4 inch to this side of the line. And then we'll cut, trim, and cut down to size, because these are going to be bigger than what we need. So those are going to go together. So now what we're going to do is we're going to work with our large trapezoid of fabric C. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one of our fabric A small trapezoids, and like we've done in the past, we're going to sew the cut edge of the two together. And always want to make sure we have a little tail on each end and kind of eyeball it. And so we'll do this for all 4 pieces. and then we'll sew those together. And at that time, we can sew these. All right, so we've got everything placed how we need them. So we'll go to the sewing machine and I'll show you how we sew these together. Just because it is something different, we've sewn all these together before in this manner, but it's something different that we haven't shown that most of you know, but I still want to show it in creation of this block. So we'll go to the sewing machine and I'll show you how to construct these half square triangles. Okay, so here we are at the sewing machine with our squares. These are our 2.5 inch squares of our fabric B and our fabric C. And so we have our line drawn from corner to corner. So what we're going to do, we are going to place this line on the right edge of our 1/4 inch foot. And we're going to sew down each side. So we've got these two done on one side. So then we'll rotate them and we'll do the same exact thing that we just did, but sew it on the opposite side. All right, so that's it when it comes to sewing. So we'll go back to the cutting table and we'll cut on that line. And then we'll have 4 separate pieces. And then we'll press those open with the iron, and then we'll trim them down to size. All right? All right, so we're back from the sewing machine and the ironing board. So we sewed all that together, and I went to the ironing board and pressed that. And so we just pressed those pieces to the dark side, just like we've done in all the other videos. And then what we did is we came back with our half square triangle pieces, and then we cut along that line that we drew. So once we do that, then we're going to press this to the dark side. And that's going to be this is going to be your half square triangle. However, we're going to cut these down to size. Because when I was putting this together, the calculation to cut this half square triangle pieces, like the little squares, it was just too much of a fraction. And I figured it's just so much easier when you're working with half square triangles is if you know what your finished size half square triangle needs to be, always cut your pieces bigger, and then you're able to trim them down, which I'll show you, so you can trim them down to the exact size you need, and then everything's perfect. You don't have to worry about one side being a little shorter than the other. So we'll go to the ironing board and we'll press these to the dark side. But what we'll do before then is we will cut these down to the next shape so we can then sew the rest of our fabric A pieces. So what we're going to do is the look we're going for is essentially this look. So we've got our piece sewn to this side, so now we need to cut down this side. So to easily do that, so here's our ruler, the easiest thing to do is to flip your piece over like this, and we'll line up that side of the ruler with our 2.5 inch large trapezoid on the Creative Grid Lazy Angle ruler, and then we'll trim this side just like that, and we'll do that to all of these pieces. And then we'll go to the sewing machine and sew these together. So you'll end up with a piece that looks just like this. Very familiar. We've done this with previous blocks. All right, so we've got all of our pieces cut. So now we can lay out where we need these pieces sewn together. And then we'll go to the sewing machine and sew them up. And I'll be back with our sewn pieces. Okay, so we're back from sewing the other small trapezoid onto our remaining pieces. And we also have our half square triangles pressed. So what we're going to want to do is, first, I like to trim when work with half square triangles. Just like with anything else, I like to clean up my edges. It just makes it easier to work with, especially when we're lining up sides and everything of our fabric. So just trim off all those dog ears from our half square triangle. And then what we're going to do is, so these need to be 1.5 inches. So like rough cut, they need to be 1.5 inches. So right now, they are right at about 2 inches square. So which is fine. They're bigger than what we need. And I did that on purpose so we get a nice finished cut. So we're going to take our 6.5 inch ruler or any smaller size square, and we are going to use this 45, this diagonal line, and we're going to align this line up with this seam on the 1.5 inch mark. So we can actually rotate this and see how this side has 1.5 and 1.5 has the fractions and this side has the whole numbers. We're going to work with this section right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up this 45 along that seam, and we're going to line it up with the 1.5 inch markings. So if you have a square, a half square triangle that's nice and clean, a perfect 45 inch corner, a perfect 90-degree corner, and everything lines up, when we line up that seam, that marking on the ruler and with our seam, and our left side and our bottom side line up perfectly with the line, we can just trim off this excess just like this. And you'll have the 1.5 inch half square triangle that you need. However, if your sides do not line up, if they're not perfectly straight, if it's not a perfect 90-degree corner, that is not a problem. Do not stress. But how you'll cut it is a little bit differently. You're going to cut it twice instead of just the once. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up. This is how we square up our half square triangle. So we're going to line up that center line of the ruler with the seam in your half square triangle. And what we want to do is we do want to pay attention to our 1.5 inch marking, because that's what we need the finished square to be. So we want to make sure we have excess beyond that. So we want to make sure, because what we're going to do is we're basically going to cut off a little bit here, and then we're going to rotate it and then cut it to size. So you want to make sure you have enough fabric to still work with when you rotate it. So what we'll do is we'll pretend like these sides just aren't right. They're just not pretty. They're just not perfectly straight. So we'll move it up a little bit. So as you can see, we're cutting off less than what we cut off for the first one, because that's what we want to do. So we'll line up ruler and seam, trim off that right in that top piece, and then you can see we have a nice clean pretty 90-degree corner, nice clean edges. Then we'll come and lay the ruler back, line up that seam, that just makes sure that our fabric is nice and straight, especially if you work with a bigger half square triangle. So we line up the left side, the bottom, and that line and that seam, and then we'll trim it again. So now this is how we can perfectly trim up a half square triangle that we need if it's just kind of really wonky. So we'll go and do that for the other two, and then we'll move on to trimming these up. All right, so we've got all our 4 half square triangles, and we'll piece those together in a little bit. But now we're going to move on to these. So what we need to do here is we're going to trim up or trim off a section. So what we need it to look like, we can rotate them all the correct way. So what we're going to do, the very last thing we need to do is we're going to essentially sew a small trapezoid from fabric B to one side of this piece, and it's going to give you this look. So we know this is what we need it to look like. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to trim a large trapezoid section off of this trapezoid. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut it here, lop this piece off, so then we can attach that to here. So let's go and do that. So you want to make sure before you start cutting that your pieces are aligned in this orientation. So the cream, or in my case the cream, but fabric C is in the V formation. So we'll line the 2.5 inch and the 2.5 inch and then cut off that right side. All right, so now we're ready to essentially attach these pieces here. So we can lay all these out how we need, and we'll just go to the sewing machine and we'll sew all this together. And of course you can pin it like I typically do. And always make sure you have your little pieces hanging off the edge, those little dog ears. All right, so I'll go to, well, before I go to the sewing machine, we'll also bring these with me. So these are going to be oriented, let's see. In a little pinwheel formation. There we are. So these will make the center, or make up the center of our block, and it's going to be a little pinwheel. So we're going to sew, these two together, right sides together. And of course, by having them pressed to different sides, that will just notch nicely in there. So you'll sew down this side here, and with the other two, you'll do the same thing. And you'll sew down this side. So we'll go take these and these to the sewing machine, and we'll be right back. Okay, so we are just about done. So we finished sewing our small fabric B trapezoid to our pieces, and this is our end result. And then we sewed 2 of our half square triangles together in pairs. And so all we need to do here is we'll then just need to sew this together, and of course have our fabric pieces notch in there to get a nice pretty point. And then once we sew that together, we'll end up with our little pinwheel. So just to finish these off, I do like to trim off these little dog ears. It just makes it easier to line up when we sew all of our squares and our little pieces together. And it just makes everything cleaner. But it does help with alignment and feeding into our machine. So once I finish this little pinwheel, which is our center, then we'll be ready to start the construction of our block. Block 10. So that's part of it. So now we just need the center. So I'm going to go finish this, and I'll be right back. Okay, so here's a little pinwheel, and like many other blocks that we've worked with, where we have many seams meeting in the center, I do press these seams open, so it really helps it to lay flat. But here's the last puzzle piece to our little puzzle. So here's our block 10 finished. So now all we have to do is sew all 3 pieces of each row together, and then our 3 rows together, and then we'll be done. So I'll go sew these pieces together, press them, and then I'll come back for our final construction. All right, here we are with our finished block. So we created our individual blocks, sewed them together, so we had 3 separate rows, and then we sewed those rows together and then pressed them. I just pressed them in this time, and voila, there's our finished block. This is block number 10. So we're using background fabric, fabric A, fabric B, and our fabric C. There's only 2 blocks, this being the second one, that uses that fabric C. I know a lot of y'all are using your fabric C as some of your sashings when you finish your quilt. So it will help distribute some more of that color. All right, well, that's it. So we've only got one more block left, and that block is going to go directly in the center of our quilt, and it's going to be a much smaller block. We're going to be using the 1.5 inch markings on our lazy angle creative grid ruler. All right, well, hope you all enjoyed making this block. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and stay tuned for next week's block. All right, happy sewing.